tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasāmi. I'd like to take leave, ask permission from the Sangha to say a few words of Dhamma and extend my greetings to everyone who's come today. It's another Sunday afternoon, practice afternoon. And so we come for the purpose of a Dhamma sharing, what we call Dhamma Savana, timely listening to Dhamma, and maybe later Dhamma Sakaja, timely discussion on Dhamma, which the Buddha said are great blessings, as well as obviously things like generosity, virtue, ethics, and the whole path of practice. But this Dhamma exchange is definitely part of our path, both giving, receiving, listening, reflecting on Dhamma. One of the causes of the arising of right view is actually what's called paratagosa, which means the word of another person or the voice of another. Wise reflection, yoniso manasikara, and paratagosa, the word of another. So it's like we do some of it ourselves, our own wise reflection, but you still need the right input. So we get by with a little help from our friends. And so hopefully I'll provide a bit of input today. I thought to say a few words on what's called it's often translated as the disadvantage or the drawback or the danger of sensuality and the benefits of renunciation. Now when the Buddha was teaching, you read in the suttas how the Buddha would often begin his presentation of the Dhamma. He wouldn't go straight to the Four Noble Truths necessarily or start talking about anatta. He had what's called a method of teaching. He called it the gradual discourse or the graduated teaching, anupubbhikata, which begins with talk on dana. So talking to people say, well, what's your teaching? You're an ascetic, you're a teacher. What do you teach? And he would begin by talk on, it's called dana gata, talk on dana, the benefits. Talk on dana, sila gata, talk on sila, sagga, which means heaven, and then what's called the disadvantage of sensuality, and then the benefits of renunciation. So all of this is before going into the Four Noble Truths. So we're very familiar, most of us, with the Four Noble Truths. You open a book about Buddhism and often will lay it out. But the path, which is what precedes it, is in a sense establishing the ground and establishing elements of right view or right perspective or right understanding. And so given that the Four Noble Truths we understand are all about dukkha and the ending of dukkha, and the Buddha actually said, my whole teaching is about dukkha and the ending of dukkha. I teach one thing, dukkha and the ending of dukkha. So everything that the Buddha was teaching is really can be put into this little framework, or this described in this way. And he also said that the Four Noble Truths is like an elephant's footprint, that anything he says can all, in the same way that any of the footprints of all the little animals in the forest, they could all fit into the elephant's footprint. The elephant's footprint is the biggest and encompasses them all. So too all of his teachings could be encompassed within the Four Noble Truths. So everything is about some aspect of sukha and dukkha, happiness and suffering, or suffering and abandoning suffering to bring on happiness. And so even dana gata, talk on dana, talk on generosity, think about generosity as, bringing food or requisites or being nice and all the various ways you can be generous. But simply it means the happiness that arises from giving or from renouncing. Ethics or silagata, we can talk about precepts, we can talk about all the ways we can develop ethics in our life, but the theme, the summary is the happiness that arises from virtue. And so these two things also then lead on to what's called Sagga. You can talk in a traditional Buddhist, Indian, Asian cosmology about heaven and realms, but essentially the meaning is, if we think in terms of Sukha and Dukkha, is the long-term benefits of ethics and generosity. So it's a kind of progression. There are short-term benefits of ethics and generosity. I've been reading Ajahn Chah recently. He was saying some people say that good actions don't bring good results. You look in the world and you see people doing good and they don't seem to get the good results. So what's this? And Luang Por Chah says, I've never done a good thing and not got a good result. Because the minute I've done it, I felt good. If I understand that the thing I'm doing is good, the result happens immediately. He's saying we don't have to wait for the future. So he's saying anyone who doesn't understand that, doesn't understand then the meaning of what a good result is. They might be looking for something material. They might be looking for something external. And so we begin leading our life, and this is very much what the Buddha called mundane right view, or the right way, the right perspective to live, the right way to think, that generosity, ethics, integrity, these lead us to basically to be happy. And it's very much bound up with the sense realm or the sense world. And heaven, the notion of heaven, basically for most people is some kind of sensual paradise. And in the world, what people generally look for and hope for would be a nice life, very much bound up with sensuality, not usually thinking in terms of a different perspective or a different route or avenue or a means of finding happiness. And I guess the Buddha or any teacher would be looking to see if the person understands so far and is ready for more. So then the next aspect, the next step, if you like, is this thing called adinavagata, the disadvantage or the danger or the drawback, the downside, the flip side, the con of sensual pleasures. And so this is something which now, talking as Buddhist practitioners, Dhamma practitioners, we have to investigate. And it can sound heavy, it can sound like something we don't really want to hear. But there are many ways, many ways that the Buddha talked about it, where we can really see, oh yeah, right, that's so true. It's very, that's the right angle, if you like, or the right perspective regarding our sensual pleasures. Now, generally, the idea of moderation, I think that's very commonly understood. Most people would all agree that, not everybody, but most people, that to moderate one's life is a good thing. Generally in all areas, most people think the idea of the middle way sounds very reasonable. Not too much, not too little. That's obviously very reasonable, and that would also apply to the sense realm. We all know, we all seen that you can't just take sensuality to an extreme very quickly. It leads you down a very, very dark path and leads to all kinds of problems. But what about sensuality per se, in and of itself? And this is a really interesting question. And so what prompted me to talk about this today was that I was recently given a book, a very interesting book, which I haven't read fully. It's one of these books by a Stanford professor of biology and neuroscience, and I'm sure you're aware that there's been so much research and understanding regarding neuroscience over the last 10, 15, 20 years, which is really shedding new light, particularly with more and more modern technologies that can show more and more clearly, visually, and through testable means what exactly is going on with our brain. and our emotions and our psychology. And so there's a very interesting and fascinating whole area of this kind of correlating these, you could say, scientific type results and investigations with the ancient Buddhist intuitive investigations. And there's a whole area where it's this kind of fascinating correlation, where things that have been understood, certainly in not just in Buddhism, but in societies and in people's lives, we can now see how it works, and those that are into the science aspect can really see on a molecular or cellular level, genetics, hormones, what's actually going on, what's kind of pushing us as people. So there's one particular little section in this book that I just happened to have a look at, where the author's describing two types of pain, and I'll try and summarize it. It's very technical, but basically there are two types of ways which we can experience pain, and there are different types of receptors, if you like, or neurons, which get stimulated at certain times. So there's one type which, say, on the surface of your skin, is very sensitive to, will get stimulated by a sharp prick, and then will send a very rapid message to your brain through whatever it is, through the lines, that you've been pricked, and you'll feel it. So like, it's what happens, say, when you have an injection, you feel this very sharp pinprick, but actually it goes away very quickly. And that we've all experienced. You just turn away for a second, and then boom, and it's gone. And as a kid, you can train yourself then not to fear the needle, because actually it's not going to last long. But then he explains how it happens, and actually there's this neuron, and then there's another one which basically sends a message to inhibit that pain. So there's a sort of second one which blocks it. So this is like one type of pain. So you get a sharp, very quick response, and then another sort of receptor blocks it. Now there's this other type of pain receptor, which is more susceptible, which is stimulated and creates a dull, throbbing pain, a deep pain, throbbing. And this is activated more slowly. And it's more longer lasting. But when it's activated, it inhibits the other type of pain. So each one inhibits the other one. So I hope you're following this. But the gist is that we have two types of pain which we can experience, like a short, quick one and a slower, throbbing one. And they effectively can inhibit one another. And now they're using this in medicine. So people who have, I was interested in this because I'm suffering a bit from this right now, this kind of ongoing lower back pain, can kind of implant little electrodes into your hip, which then stimulate and sort of put a bit of pain in your hip, which then manages to inhibit your lower back pain. So, okay, it's very interesting. But what really struck me was that this was a paradigm, this was something that the Buddha pointed to in one of his really, for me, it's like remarkable sutta, remarkable teaching. Those of you that like to read, it's in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 75, it's called the Magandiya Sutta. And the gist is that the Buddha is talking to a man who's called Magandiya, who basically is in favor of or is for sensual pleasures as a route to, say, happiness or spiritual development. And he's critical of the Buddha. He calls him a destroyer of growth because he sees the Buddha as trying to cut off pleasure of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. And so the Buddha's explaining to him that actually there's this whole different type of happiness, and that once you've experienced one type of happiness, you're never going to get drawn to sensual happiness. So, okay, that doesn't prove anything. But then the Buddha goes on to give a simile of a leper. So he asked this man, Magandiya, he says, and in India, especially if any of you have been to India, there are still lepers today, and it's a very, very horrible thing. And throughout history, it's been a kind of disease which is really feared and is understood to be very, very painful and horrible. And lepers would what's called cauterize, or more or less roast themselves, roast their flesh. They're kind of rotting already. And then in roasting yourself over this fire, or sort of burning yourself, scalding yourself, the reason being that you somehow experience some kind of alleviation from that deep, deep throbbing and burning and rotting sensation of the leprosy. So the Buddha asked this man Magandiya, what do you think if a leper who was suffering from leprosy and would cauterize, burning himself over this fire, if his friends were to bring a doctor or some medicine and cure him, then later on looking at other lepers, would he envy them for their fire or for roasting themselves? And Magandiya always says, well, no. He says, well, why not? He says, well, now he's cured. He has no need to roast himself or for any medicine. And so the Buddha asks him again, says, and what if two men were to grab him by each arm, two strong men, and drag him towards the fire? Wouldn't he twist and turn his body this way and that and try to get away? And Magandiya says, yes, he would. And the Buddha says, well, why? And Magandiya says, well, because the fire is scorching and burning, and on touching it he would experience pain. So then the Buddha asked Magandiya, well, is it only now that the fire is scorching and painful? Or formerly, when he had his leprosy and was cauterizing himself, was it then scorching and painful? And so Magandiya says, no, then it was also scorching and painful. But at the time, because his faculties were distorted, he experienced it as somehow pleasurable, gave him some relief from the pain. So that's when the Buddha says, yes, so too, Magandiya says, beings are burnt by the fever of sensuality, which is painful and scorching, but on account of their distorted faculties, they experience some pleasure from it, they experience some alleviation. And then the Buddha also, in talking about the lepers, says, the more the lepers burn themselves and cauterize themselves, the more foul and the more rotting their leprosy gets, yet still they experience more and more of a measure of satisfaction. So it's the pointing to the fact that you just goes more and more and more. But the worse it gets, the more you need. So it's basically pointing so clearly to what we would understand as the addiction principle. But this was like really, I remember reading this many years ago, and just really eye-opening, because for a lot of us this sensual renunciation, or the disadvantage of sensuality, we tend to look at it in the long term. We know that yes, if I indulge in sensuality today, it's pleasant today, but I'll regret it tomorrow. And we can think of, and we can look at all the ways that it plays out. And it's generally the idea that pleasure today brings some dukkha tomorrow, and you don't want to, you have to more or less go against that, hold away, keep away from that pleasure, and then slowly then, of course, move away from the whole craving. So that we understand, but this in this Magandiya Sutta, so that you could call it the Magandiya principle, or the principle of the leper, pointing to the fact that actually right here, right now, it's somehow painful for us. So again, to go back to this image from the neuroscience, it's that one painful stimulus somehow blocks, if you like, the other one. So that one type of painful stimulus can effectively block, and temporarily anyway, alleviate another one. But the point is, at that time, it's still some kind of painful stimulus. So certainly from the perspective of liberation, or some kind of sustainable solution, it's not that. It's neither sustainable nor liberating, because you're always going to be needing something. You're always doing what you could call dukkha, or pain management. You got something here, you got to tweak it there, and then that goes away, and then you got to tweak it there. So you're still on this roller coaster, or you're still somehow on the Titanic. So So just then seeing not only the long-term limitations of sensuality in the sense of the dukkha and the whole process, because there are many ways the Buddha described dukkha. He talked about suffering as what's called viparinama, which means subject to change, or if you like, changeful or not sure, and the conditioned nature of it. This we all understand. But the fact that sensuality itself is described by the Buddha as actually painful, but because of distorted faculties, we experience it as pleasurable. And so then you think about that. I'm sure we all had experiences of both that pain management thing. I remember myself when I was young, going on holiday to Asia, I would almost always get like an eye infection. Maybe just the change of weather, or the different kind of germs, or swimming in pools. And it happened every year. You feel this itch coming on maybe one evening, and you just know, like, don't scratch it, don't scratch it. And then kind of you can bear with this itch, and then it reaches a point where you just couldn't bear it any longer, and just do an intense eye rub, knowing that this is bad, this is not good. And it brings on this, it kind of alleviates that itching for a while, and then you actually get really intense. There's almost a kind of burning, and then you stop, and then there's this kind of ease. And then you just sit there and you just wait, you just say, please don't come back, please don't come back. And then the itch just comes back all the more intense, and you know that. So I'm sure we've all had that kind of experience. And so that's the one from with our own pain, and also obviously with sensuality. I'm sure it's very easy then to think back and to see how experiences that we take to be somehow pleasurable in another context. So like the Buddha is talking to Magandiya, and he says, why I'm not drawn to sensuality is that I experience a happiness other than sensual pleasures. So again, the context is once you experience something different, then of course sensual pleasures are not going to feel the same way. So, like an obvious example would be, say, you're going out for an evening out. We've all done that, gone out, music, nightclub, whatever, smoky atmosphere, lots of stimulation, very enjoyable. But on another occasion, maybe when you're feeling different, that same thing, it would just be experienced as very, very painful. So that whole notion of what is sensually pleasurable is obviously some kind of very, very subjective experience. But that, say, thumping loud music and the smoky atmosphere, that would be the same. So it was dukkha then, and it would be dukkha now. But because of where we were at the time, we want that. That's craving. Craving basically deludes us. And the Buddha was saying, craving deludes us into thinking that those things are actually unpleasant, are somehow pleasant. And so generally we kind of manage it, because for most people, and certainly in the kind of common way of thinking, well, there's no real option. And so that's fine. That's what the Buddha called, like a wholesome life, living the 5 precepts. It's called worldly right view. But beginning to talk about the disadvantage of sensuality, and then the next, once you're open to the disadvantage of sensuality, then it's obviously a pair with the benefits of sensual renunciation. Now it's moving towards, it's a bit like the tipping point, where the Buddha's teachings begin to move towards, from the lokiya, from the mundane or the worldly, to the supramundane, now moving beyond sukha and dukkha. And so then it's a very natural process of thinking about how advantageous or beneficial it is to be very aware or be very, very careful about our relationship to the sense realm, basically not wanting to burn ourselves. We've burnt ourselves so many times. Why are we going to keep doing it? And so we work first with the very coarse ways in which we burn ourselves, our very coarse addictions. But then, like everything, it's like any kind of skill which we take up, or music, or sport, or any kind of language. You inevitably, you can't stop getting more and more refined. Basically, you get better and better at it, and the better you get at it, the more you see, the more you understand, the more you want to the deeper you want to go into it. So what was perceived, your first steps, then lead on, lead on, lead on. So this is how this Dhamma leads onwards, leads inwards. And so the more we turn away from the sense realm in general, then of course the more we turn inwards. And so that's the point then the Buddha would be teaching the Four Noble Truths. So for me, just to again emphasize that there's so many different ways that the disadvantage of the what's called Kama, or the sensual realm, or this sensual world was taught. But this one for me really stands out as almost pointing to the fact that even the word sensual pleasure is a term which doesn't quite capture it. It's the apparent sense of sense pleasure, or the creation of sense pleasure, or the deluded experience of sense pleasure, which is actually something which is sense pain, some kind of stimulus which actually, if you're peaceful, you wouldn't want. And so that is also an aspect of faith, and people would have to, you have to feel a sense of, yes, there's an alternative, and that the peace of mind is a viable, realizable goal, and a valid one. And so that's obviously how right view, the path works, very much like a unit, like I've said before, like a braid, where right view and then right, all the various factors, sila, samadhi and panya, right view is bound up with panya, works with samadhi. Of course, if your mind can taste a bit of peace, or even just come and spend a day in the monastery, then you view a stimulating sensual activity or environment in a very different way, because your mind is shifted, basically. The experience has shifted. And so you begin to understand more and more and incline more towards that peace. And that which is, it's difficult, because another point made in this book is that the mind is very, very active. Its nature, almost by definition, is to be active. So it's important not to underestimate, you could say, the challenge of simply finding contentment, stilling the mind. It's very, very, in many ways, runs counter to our conditioning, cultural conditioning, genetic conditioning, all that stuff, and what we've grown up with. So this is no small undertaking. But like everything, like say, giving up things, willpower is hard. Doing things by sheer force of will, or by just sheer belief, or just by somebody else forcing you, that's not the Buddha's route. There's a role for willpower, of course, making determinations and sticking to your goals. But the Buddha's route is very much bound up with wisdom, where you have to understand first why we're doing this practice. And so it's really important for us to have these little insights into these parts of the path that can seem quite, very far off, renouncing sensuality, or very challenging. But if we've seen it for ourselves, at least we can say, oh yes, I see why, and that's really important. And then we begin to make these new intentions, or these jetanas. So a little catchphrase popped into my head last week, was that another way of translating intention or cetana is will. So in a sense, it's not a path of willpower, but the power of will. That means putting in place lots and lots of little intentions, willing yourself in the right way, and that these build up, and these essentially will be what gives us power in our practice. You could say these are the little karmic drops. The Buddha said, drop by drop, the large water jar is filled up. So each drop is a little right intention. And right intention is the intention of non-cruelty, the intention of non-ill will, and the intention of sensuality. So it's a very, very important integral part of this practice of Dhamma, which if we don't quite have this, if we don't quite see this, it's a little bit like, a bit like driving with the handbrake on. You're trying to practice and practice, but there's something holding you back. There's always this hankering for, whether it's the sense realm, or not really wanting to really give up and see that really it's actually that less is actually more. It's that the peaceful mind, the still mind, is actually the genuinely happy one, and that the potential pleasure which we perceive is basically a deluded one. It's not totally deluded, and in worldly terms, quite understandable. But in terms of liberation, or if we're talking about the Four Noble Truths, then there's no doubt at all. Craving is a source of dukkha, second noble truth. It's a non-negotiable part of the Buddha's teachings. But it's hard to take on, it's hard to accept. And so the more of these little kind of insights or perspectives shining the light in a different way, certainly it kind of makes it easier to accept, and then we can actually, directly work with it, feel drawn to essential experience. And why am I drawn to this? And think, okay, I'm experiencing some dukkha. Now, if I have that, what's it involve? And then the more you investigate it, the more you see actually there's more dukkha than sukha. There's more suffering or unsatisfactoriness in that very sense experience than satisfactoriness. But I create a whole world around it, a whole kind of construct. And that's what I buy into. And so this can be sort of very, very useful. Then, of course, when we get to the Four Noble Truths, our practice, we're in a place then to work in a more direct, immediate way with the six sense bases. Many of you will be familiar with these very sort of profound teachings, like in the seen, there'll just be the seen. In the heard, will just be the heard. So that means like you train yourself in sight, there's just sight, rather than creating it into some object which you like or dislike. Sound is just sound, just that. In whatever's perceived is just perceived. Whatever cognized, just cognized. It's a very refined level of practice. Or what Lumpur Pasano often likes to refer to as appapanchang papancheti, not to complicate the uncomplicated. Not to complicate the uncomplicated, or not to differentiate the undifferentiated. Basically, not creating a whole world of stuff from our sense experience. Very much seeing it as just that, and that's really way taking us inwards, and what really leads us to this, the peace and silence, say on a very refined level, but without having seen the danger of all that creation and complication and proliferation. It's very hard to do. My experience always is this kind of like struggle. It's like, yes, it's good for me and I should see it like this, but I don't want to, and how can I? But the minute, this simile of the leper, seeing that I've just been burning myself, for so long, even the subtle little burns, the subtle little pinpricks, I don't need that anymore. Very much opens the door to contemplating more of the Four Noble Truths and more of the letting go. So today I just say a few words basically based on what the Buddha called the graduated or the gradual discourse, of focusing on the aspects where it turns from the more worldly happiness, which we understand, sila, ethics, we've got the Sutta on the Great Blessings, right livelihood, and the kind of linchpin, if you like, or the fulcrum where we genuinely see all of this sensuality, this nice life. It's good, but it's just limited. And not only is it limited, even the aspect of it being good is a kind of conditioned goodness by a deluded perspective. And the delusion is subtle. It's not a very blameworthy one. It's not like, it's kind of very different from people who are leading a very, very unskillful life. But it's deluded in the sense it's not liberating. And so, as the Buddha said, he's only teaching suffering and the end of suffering. The Buddha's wish, Lumpur Cha reading it again and again, he only wants people to go beyond suffering. And so from that perspective, it's a limited one. So I want to share this today and hope that we can use these little reflections and carry on with our sort of journey inwards and our contemplation on these themes.